8 out of every 10 Iranian missiles are getting through. Not a few, not some. 80%. That number comes not from Tehran's state media, not from an anti-war think tank, but from assessments circulating among Western defense analysts watching this conflict unfold in real time. Iron Dome, Arrow, David Sling, the layered architecture that Israel spent decades and billions building, is being overwhelmed. Not broken, not destroyed. Simply overwhelmed by volume, by variety, by an adversary that studied the system long enough to understand exactly where the gaps are. And Iran is not running out of missiles. This is the fact that changes everything else. Because the entire strategic logic of this war, from the moment the first American and Israeli strikes hit Iranian soil, rested on a quiet assumption that Iran's arsenal was finite, that sustained pressure would degrade it, that sooner or later the launches would slow and the silence would be called victory. That assumption is now dead. Independent tracking of launch frequencies shows no meaningful decline. The salvo sizes are not shrinking. If anything, the cadence has held so steady that military analysts are beginning to ask a different question entirely. Not when Iran runs out, but whether Iran ever intended to use its full capacity at all. Whether what we are seeing right now is not Iran's ceiling, but Iran's floor. Cast your mind back to the summer of the previous year. Israel was burning through its interception missiles faster than its allies could resupply them. Emergency shipments from the United States bought time, but the arithmetic was already turning ugly. Interception is expensive. Each Arrow missile costs roughly $3 million. Each Iranian ballistic missile costs a fraction of that. Iran does not need to win every exchange. It only needs to keep the exchange rate unfavorable, and at 80% penetration, it is doing exactly that. Now add the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has seized effective control of the world's most important waterway. Roughly 20% of all globally traded oil passes through that narrow channel between the Iranian coast and the Omani Peninsula. It is closed. Not disrupted, closed. That is not a Houthi situation. The Houthis harassed shipping in the Red Sea for months before the United States negotiated a ceasefire, and that negotiation worked precisely because the Houthis had limited leverage and no strategic depth. Iran has both. It has naval assets, coastal missile batteries, drone swarms, and a declared policy of treating the strait as sovereign territory under active military administration. It is not harassing the strait. It is governing it. And according to sources tracking Iranian military communications, Tehran is now drawing up formal frameworks to institutionalize that control. Legal structures, patrol schedules, inspection protocols. Iran is not holding the strait hostage. Iran is building a new fact. So here is the question that no one in Washington or Jerusalem has answered clearly. Why would Iran agree to a ceasefire right now? Think about it from Tehran's position. They are absorbing strikes, yes. Their air force has taken losses. Some of their naval surface capacity has been degraded, but their strategic position has never been stronger. They hold the strait. Their missiles are still flying. Their proxies, battered but functional, are still operating across multiple theaters. Every week that passes without a negotiated settlement is a week in which Iran demonstrates something to the entire watching world, that American military dominance in the Middle East has a ceiling and Iran has found it. The answer came live, mid-conversation, as analysts were still processing the overnight damage reports. A fresh salvo, not a large one, not aimed at maximizing casualties, aimed at making a statement. Iran fired again specifically to puncture any narrative that it was exhausted, deterred, or desperate for an off-ramp. The message was surgical in its clarity. We choose when this pauses, not you. Here is what makes this so difficult to absorb. The United States and Israel entered this war with overwhelming conventional advantages. air power, precision targeting, intelligence, logistics. Those advantages have not disappeared, but they have proven insufficient. Sufficient to cause damage, insufficient to force a decision. And in warfare, there is a very specific word for a military campaign that causes enormous damage without forcing a decision. That word is failure. The trajectory is visible. The momentum belongs to Iran. And as of today, no military official, no strategic analyst, no government spokesperson has offered a coherent account of how that trajectory reverses. Which brings us to the story being told in Washington, the victory narrative, and why it may be the most dangerous fiction of this entire war. Before the first missile left its launcher, 5 goals were announced to the world. Regime change in Tehran, the permanent end of Iranian nuclear enrichment, the elimination of Iran's ballistic missile program, the severing of financial and military support to Iran's regional proxies, the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the broad, devastating degradation of Iranian power as a signal to every adversary watching from Beijing to Pyongyang. These were not whispered ambitions. They were stated objectives, repeated on television, printed in briefings, used to justify the opening of a war that has now cost hundreds of lives and triggered a global economic emergency. Not one of them has been achieved. The Houthis are still operating. Hamas still exists as a political and military force. Hezbollah, though weakened over the past 18 months, has not been dismantled. Iran's nuclear program, its centrifuges, its enriched stockpiles, its underground infrastructure at Fordow and Natanz was not destroyed in the opening strikes. The regime in Tehran is not collapsing. Supreme Leader Khamenei appeared on state television 4 days ago. The Revolutionary Guard is intact. The government is functioning. Whatever this war has done, it has not done any of the things it was launched to do. So the story changed. Secretary of State Rubio, appearing before cameras last week, described the war's accomplishments in newly reframed terms. Iran's air force, he said, had been largely destroyed. Iran's naval surface fleet had been severely degraded. These were presented as the central achievements of the campaign, proof that the mission was succeeding, that American power had been decisive. The problem is not that these statements are false. Iran's air force has indeed taken serious losses. The problem is that nobody considered Iran's air force important before the war started. Iran's strategic power was never built around its fighter jets. Every serious analyst, inside the Pentagon, inside Israeli military intelligence, inside every European defense ministry, understood that Iran's real arsenal was its ballistic missiles, its drone capacity, its network of regional proxies, and its geographic control over the Strait of Hormuz. Destroying Iran's aging fleet of aircraft is like winning a chess match by capturing your opponent's pawns and then declaring checkmate. The pieces that actually threaten you are still on the board. The nuclear framing has become almost surreal. Rubio and others have pointed out that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon, as though this is a battlefield achievement. Iran did not have a nuclear weapon before the war began. Preventing something that had not yet happened, while failing to eliminate the enrichment infrastructure that could still produce it, is not a victory condition. It is a baseline. And even that baseline is now more fragile than before because the inspectors are gone, the monitoring is disrupted, and Tehran has every political incentive to accelerate whatever program survived the strikes. Then came the statement from Iran's foreign ministry that ripped the floor out from under the entire diplomatic narrative. Trump had said publicly, explicitly in front of cameras, that Iran had requested a ceasefire, that Iran had reached out, that the overture had come from Tehran. Iran's foreign ministry responded within hours. No such request was made, they said. No communication of that kind occurred. We have not asked for a ceasefire, and we are not asking for one now. Two governments, in direct and public contradiction on the single most important factual question of the moment. Who is trying to stop this war, and why? One of them is lying. And given that Iran simultaneously fired a fresh missile salvo the same afternoon, not the behavior of a government quietly seeking an exit, the geometry of that lie is not difficult to read. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz sits closed, and the Gulf allies who trusted American security guarantees are absorbing the consequences. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar. These are nations whose entire economic architecture depends on oil export routes that no longer function. The United Arab Emirates is watching Iranian military infrastructure consolidate on a waterway that carries the lifeblood of its economy. These governments were not consulted before this war began. They are now being asked to absorb its costs. Privately, the signals coming from Gulf capitals are not those of confident allies. They are the signals of governments quietly calculating their options. Any mission accomplished moment, any declaration that the objectives have been met, that American strength has prevailed, that the enemy has been brought to heel, will require the world to disbelieve what it can plainly see. Closed shipping lanes, a missile program still firing, a regime still standing, a foreign ministry publicly calling the President of the United States a liar. Some fictions are sustainable for a while. Some collapse the moment they meet reality. The question is what happens when this one does, and whether the U.S. has any leverage left when it does. 40% of the world's traded oil, 20% of its liquefied natural gas, significant shares of its aluminum, its fertilizer, its desalinated water. All of it moves through or depends on a channel of water roughly 33 miles wide at its narrowest point. The Strait of Hormuz is closed, and the consequences are not coming. They are here. South Korea began fuel rationing 11 days ago. Vietnam has seen street protests over shortages that have emptied petrol stations in 3 provinces. Australia's government issued its first formal fuel security advisory since the 1970s. These are not war zones. These are stable, prosperous democracies on the other side of the planet, and they are already feeling the physical weight of a conflict they had no hand in starting. The disruption is not priced in. It is not stabilizing. It is compounding. Fertilizer is the story that almost no one is covering, and it may end up being the most consequential of all. The Gulf states produce a substantial share of the world's ammonia and urea, the chemical foundations of modern agricultural yield. Shipping routes are blocked. Production facilities in the UAE are operating at reduced capacity due to power disruptions. The planting season in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa does not wait for geopolitical resolution. Farmers who cannot get fertilizer this spring will not get a second chance until next year. The food security consequences of a prolonged closure are not measured in months. They are measured in harvests. And the next harvest is already at risk. Europe is watching all of this through a particular kind of dread. The European economy entered this year fragile. Slowing growth, persistent inflation, industrial sectors already hollowed out by the energy crisis that followed Russia's invasion of Ukraine. High oil prices were the wound that would not close. Now they are being torn open again. Brent crude has moved above $140 a barrel and is not retreating. European manufacturers are making calculations about whether to continue operating. German industrial output, already under pressure, faces a structural shock that its government has no clear instrument to address. And here, the geopolitics become genuinely dangerous in a way that goes beyond the battlefield. Because Europe has an option. An ugly option, a politically toxic option, but an option nonetheless. Russia's gas pipelines still exist. Nord Stream 1 was repaired quietly 2 years ago. The infrastructure is there, And as the economic pain deepens, the political pressure on European governments to seek some accommodation with Moscow to trade principles for heating and production will grow in ways that no Brussels communiqué can fully suppress. Trump has already poisoned the well by threatening NATO withdrawal, blaming European governments for failing to join a war that was never an Article 5 situation, that was never a collective defense obligation, that was a unilateral American decision made without meaningful allied consultation. This is the architecture of the blame shifting that is already being constructed. Ukraine is deteriorating in parallel. American weapons flows have slowed. Russian oil revenues, lifted by reduced sanctions enforcement and Asian demand, are funding a war machine that is grinding forward along a front line that was already under pressure before the Middle East consumed Washington's attention. By late summer, the outline of a dual failure, Iran and Ukraine both unresolved, both trending in the wrong direction, will be impossible to conceal. And Trump's political strategy, already visible in the rhetoric, will be to hand Europe the bill for both. You didn't help. You didn't commit. You freeloaded on American power and then complained when we used it. Whatever goes wrong is yours. It is a coherent political narrative. It is also completely detached from what actually happened, which leaves the world staring at the only exit that actually exists. And it is a brutal one. If the global economy continues to spiral, if fuel rationing spreads from South Korea to Southeast Asia to Europe, if agricultural systems begin to crack under fertilizer shortages, then Trump will face a pressure that no political narrative can absorb indefinitely. The pressure of consequences that are visible, physical, and arriving in the lives of ordinary people in ways that polling numbers cannot obscure. At that point, the United States may have no realistic option but to give Iran the majority of what it is asking for in a negotiated settlement: sanctions relief, security guarantees, formal recognition of Iranian influence in the Gulf. The Strait reopened in exchange for terms that, had they been offered 2 months ago, would have been called appeasement. The iceberg is visible. The ship is still moving toward it. Most of the serious people in the room, in Washington, in Brussels, in Gulf capitals, in the quiet offices of the IMF and the World Bank, can see the same trajectory. The war must stop. The strait must reopen. And the only way either of those things happens is if the United States finds a way to accommodate an adversary it went to war to destroy. Whether the men making these decisions are capable of that reversal, whether the politics allow it, whether the pride permits it, is the question on which everything now depends.